For 20 years, Sheriff Thomas Caldwell was the embodiment of law, order, and stability in the small town of Millstone, Georgia. He was the kind of man folks pointed to with pride when outsiders asked about their community. Strong shoulders, a firm handshake, and a gaze that could silence troublemakers before they even thought of starting anything. Thomas wasn't just a law. To many, he was a town itself. Every Sunday morning, Thomas and his wife Evelyn slipped into the second pew of the White Steeple Baptist Church, side by side, always together. The congregation whispered about them with admiration. Evelyn, with her calm smile and graceful presence, balanced her husband's stoic authority. She organized church suppers, brought casseroles to sick neighbors, and somehow remembered everyone's birthday. If Thomas was the spine of Millstone, Evelyn was at heart. They lived in a modest but dignified home on a tree-lined street, a 2-story brick house with green shutters and a wide porch where the sheriff liked to sip his sweet tea in the evenings. Evelyn tended to a rose garden that bloomed brighter than any others in town, and people often said her roses were proof that God favored her hands. To Thomas, those roses symbolized everything his life had become: orderly, fruitful, dependable. On the night of their 20th wedding anniversary, Thomas stood in that garden, staring at the house he had built with his own hands. The windows glowed with warm light, and the smell of Evelyn's pot roast drifted to the open kitchen door. His heart swelled with the familiar pride of a man who believed his life had been well lived. Inside, Evelyn lit candles at the dinner table. Her auburn hair shimmered in the low light, and she wore the pearl necklace Thomas had given her on their 10th anniversary. She looked up at him with eyes that still carried the spark of their younger years. "You're quiet tonight," Evelyn said gently as she set the last dish on the table. "Just thinking," Thomas replied, lowering himself into the chair across from her. His voice carried the steady tone that once reassured nervous rookies at the sheriff's office. 20 years, Evie. 20 years of you putting up with me." She laughed softly, that melodic sound that always seemed to smooth the edges of his rough days. "I'd say it's been the other way around. Sheriff Caldwell." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. His grip was strong but tender. "Don't know what I'd do without you, Evelyn." For a moment, time slowed. The flickering candles painted their faces in gold. The house around them hushed as if honoring the milestone. Thomas studied her features, the fine lines near her eyes, the graceful way she carried herself, the familiar warmth that had anchored him through decades of storms. In that moment, he believed he was the luckiest man alive. After dinner, they stepped out onto the porch, where the Georgian night wrapped around them in a blanket of cicada hums and distant dog barks. Evelyn leaned into Thomas, resting her head against his chest. He kissed the top of her hair, breathing in the lavender scent that always clung to her. "Here's to 20 more," he whispered. Evelyn smiled but didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked toward the roses blooming in the moonlight, her expression unreadable, as if some private thought passed behind her gaze. Then she looked back at him and said softly, "Yes, 20 more." Thomas didn't notice the faint tremor in her voice. He didn't see the shadow that crossed her face when she turned away. To him, life was steady, unshakable. But the truth was already sitting quietly between them, like a serpent coiled beneath the roses, waiting for its chance to strike. The weeks after their anniversary carried the same rhythm of small-town life that Thomas Caldwell had always known. Morning coffee at the kitchen table, patrol around Millstone's quiet streets, dinner with Evelyn in the evening, the familiar sound of her humming drifting from the kitchen as he cleaned his service pistol at the table. Everything looked exactly as it should. And yet, something in Thomas had shifted. It wasn't the town. It wasn't his job. It was Evelyn. Or rather, something about her that suddenly gnawed at him, like a splinter buried beneath the skin. It began one morning, when he stopped at the sheriff's office to pick up an old case file. He noticed how the younger deputies joked about their wives, swapping stories about high school sweethearts and hometown connections. Thomas realized, with a strange jolt, that he couldn't tell those same stories about Evelyn. She had always been vague about her youth. No childhood photos on display. No high school yearbook tucked in a drawer. No cousins dropping by to reminisce. That night, as Evelyn washed dishes, Thomas leaned against the doorframe and asked, "Why don't we ever see your folks? Your kin?" her hand still for a moment before she resumed scrubbing. "You know this, Tom. They're gone. I didn't keep in touch with anyone else." "You've never talked much about them," he pressed, his tone softer than the suspicion burning inside him. Evelyn turned, her smile a little too quick, her voice a little too light. "What's there to say? I had you. We built our own family." He nodded, but unease lodged itself deeper. The feeling only grew weeks later, when Evelyn complained of stomach pains. Thomas offered to drive her to Dr. Howard, the town physician, but she refused. "Just indigestion," she said, brushing it off. But she canceled the appointment without explanation, and when he asked again, she snapped in a way that startled him. "I don't need every ache and pain written down in some file," she said sharply before softening, touching his arm. "Please, Tom, let it go." He did, for the moment, but the word stuck like a burr in his mind. One rainy evening, while searching for his old military medals in the garage, Thomas stumbled across a wooden box tucked behind paint cans and rusted tools. It was Evelyn's handwriting on the lid, neat and careful. Curiosity tugged at him. He opened it. Inside were papers, yellow documents, brittle with age. At first glance, they looked like medical records. Thomas lifted one sheet, and his heart froze. Birth certificate, Daniel Whitaker. His eyes blurred, scanning down the page. Male, born in Atlanta. Parents' names he had never heard. Another envelope held surgical forms. Language clinical and stark. Gender reassignment. Hormonal therapy. Thomas's breath caught. His world tilted violently, as though the floor had given way beneath him. Evelyn, his Evelyn, had been born a man. He staggered back, the box clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like gunfire in the empty garage. For a long time, he just stood there, chest heaving, papers scattered at his boots. 20 years of marriage unraveled before his eyes. Every kiss, every embrace, every whispered word of devotion, suddenly draped in the suffocating shadow of deception. Memories flashed unbidden. Evelyn's reluctance to visit doctors, her avoidance of family history, the way she'd always changed the subject when childhood came up. He had dismissed them as quirks. Now they screamed like sirens. Thomas sank onto an old wooden stool, gripping the edge as though it might keep him upright. His thoughts crashed together in a storm of disbelief and betrayal. How could she, he whispered to the shadows, how could she lie to me for 20 years? The rain hammered harder against the garage roof, drowning his voice, but the rage in his chest built like thunder. When Evelyn called from the kitchen, "Tom, dinner's ready." Her voice carried the same gentle warmth he'd known for 2 decades, but now it cut through him like a blade. He stared at the scattered papers, his jaw clenched. The sheriff of Millstone, a man who enforced truth in law, had been living in a lie deeper than any case he'd ever prosecuted. For the first time in his life, Thomas Caldwell didn't feel like a protector. He felt like a fool. Thomas Caldwell barely slept that night. He lay rigid in bed beside Evelyn, staring at the ceiling, her steady breathing a cruel reminder of the life they had built together. He could still see the documents scattered across the garage floor. Daniel Whitaker, male. His mind replayed those words over and over until they carved themselves into his chest like a brand. Every time Evelyn stirred in her sleep, he flinched. Her hand brushed his arm once, and he pulled away before he even realized what he'd done. She murmured his name softly in her dreams, but to Thomas it sounded hollow now, like a stranger's voice. When dawn crept through the blinds, Thomas dressed in silence and left the sheriff's office before Evelyn woke. The early morning air was thick with humidity, but his skin felt cold, clammy. For the first time in his career, he dreaded the sight of the badge on his chest. How could he enforce truth, demand honesty from criminals, when the person closest to him had hidden something so enormous? At the office, his deputies noticed his distracted demeanor. Normally, he greeted them with curt nods, a clap on the shoulder, or a gruff joke. But today he marched straight into his office, closed the door, and stared at the wall. The walls, once lined with commendations and photographs of him with community leaders, now felt like they were mocking him. Sheriff Caldwell, the man who couldn't even see the truth in his own home. Hours later, Deputy Frank Harlan knocked on his door. Frank had been Thomas's closest friend for decades, a man of the same age, weathered and steady, the kind of deputy you trusted your life with. "You look like hell, Tom," Frank said bluntly as he stepped inside. Thomas forced a smirk. "That obvious, huh?" "More than obvious," Frank replied, settling into the chair across from him. "Talk to me. What's going on?" For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. He fiddled with the pen on his desk, his jaw tight. The words clawed at his throat, but saying them aloud felt impossible. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low, strained. "Frank, what would you do if you found out your whole marriage was built on a lie?" Frank's brow furrowed. "What kind of lie are we talking about?" "The worst kind," Thomas muttered, his eyes hard on the desk. Frank leaned forward. "Tom, whatever it is, don't let anger be the sheriff of your soul. You spent your life keeping order in this town. Don't lose in your own house." The advice, meant to soothe, only fanned the fire in Thomas's chest. His hand curled into a fist. "You don't understand, Frank. 20 years. 20 years she looked me in the eye every night, every morning, and never told me the truth. What kind of love is that?" Frank studied him carefully. "Sometimes people hide things out of fear, not malice. You sure you're seeing the whole picture?" But Thomas shook his head violently. "No, fear doesn't excuse deceit. Fear doesn't excuse this." His voice cracked, the weight of betrayal lacing every word. Frank hesitated, then spoke softly. "You still love her, don't you?" The question pierced him. Love. Did he? Or had love turned into something else? Something poisoned by secrecy? He wanted to say yes, but the word caught in his throat like glass. When Thomas returned home that evening, Evelyn greeted him with her usual warmth. Dinner was ready, candles lit, as though nothing had changed. She kissed his cheek, but he stiffened under her touch. She noticed, and her smile faltered. "Tom, what's wrong?" she asked gently, searching his face. He wanted to shout, to demand the truth, to throw those documents in her face. But instead he muttered, "Long day," and sat at the table, staring at the meal he suddenly had no appetite for. As Evelyn talked about errands and church events, her voice blurred into background noise. He studied her across the table. The woman he had loved, the woman he thought he knew. Was she still Evelyn, or had she always been Daniel in disguise? Every laugh, every touch, every whispered promise of the last 20 years. Were they real, or were they performances in the greatest deception of his life? That night, long after Evelyn went to bed, Thomas poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat alone in the living room. He stared at the photographs on the mantel, their wedding day, vacations, Christmas mornings, smiling faces frozen in time, mocking him now with their false sense of security. He whispered into the silence, "Who the hell are you, Evelyn?" The storm inside him raged louder than the crickets outside the window. Betrayal bled into anger, anger into shame, shame into something darker. The sheriff of Millstone had always believed justice was clear, black and white. But now, as the truth ate at him from within, he was no longer sure who he was. Husband, protector, or fool on the edge of becoming something far more dangerous. The storm Thomas had carried inside him for days finally broke on a warm summer night. The house was quiet, the air thick with the scent of Evelyn's roses drifting through the open windows. The clock in the living room ticked steadily, each sound reminding Thomas that he could not keep silent any longer. He sat in his armchair, still wearing his uniform though the workday had ended hours ago. His badge glinted faintly in the lamplight, but for the first time in his life, it felt heavy on his chest, like a piece of iron pulling him into the ground. His service pistol rested in its holster at his hip, as it always did. But tonight its presence felt different, almost menacing, as though it knew what was coming. "Evelyn," he called softly. She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel, her face warm and unsuspecting. "What is it, Tom? You look pale." "Sit down," he said, his voice low, controlled, but trembling beneath the surface. Her brow furrowed at the tone. Still, she walked over and sat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "You're scaring me." For a moment he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, the weight of 20 years pressing down on him. Then he pulled the crumpled birth certificate from his pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table between them. Her eyes flicked to the paper, then back to his face. The color drained from her cheeks. "Where'd you find that?" she whispered. "In the garage," Thomas growled. His voice rose, sharp and accusing. "In a box you thought I'd never see. Daniel Whitaker. That's who you were before you became. Evelyn Caldwell." Her lips parted, trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. 20 years. Thomas roared, slamming his fist against the arm of the chair. 20 years you looked me in the eye and let me believe a lie. My whole damn marriage, my life, built on nothing but deception. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. She reached across the table, but he jerked back. "I never wanted to hurt you," she pleaded. "Tom, listen to me. I became Evelyn long before I met you. I wasn't tricking you. I was living. Loving you wasn't a lie. It was the truest thing I've ever known. You should have told me," he snapped. His voice cracked under the weight of anger and pain. "You should have given me the choice. Instead, you let me parade around this town, proud of my marriage, proud of my wife, while the truth sat rotting in some box like poison." Evelyn shook her head desperately. "I was terrified. You're a sheriff, a man of the law, a man everyone looks up to. I thought if you knew you'd leave me, or worse, you'd hate me. I couldn't bear that, so I stayed silent. I chose love over fear. Love." He spat the word like it burned his tongue. "You call this love? You made a fool of me, Evelyn. Every vow, every kiss, it all feels like theater now." She rose to her feet, her tears streaming. "No, don't say that. I have loved you every day of our marriage. Nothing about that is fake." Thomas stood too, towering over her, his hand brushing the grip of his pistol without him realizing it. His voice shook with rage. "The town sees me as a man of strength, of integrity. Do you know what happens if they find out? If they know my wife was born a man, I'll be destroyed. My name, my badge gone." Evelyn's voice broke as she stepped closer. "Please, Tom, look at me. I am Evelyn. I've always been Evelyn. The woman who made your coffee every morning, who held your hand at funerals, who kissed you good night. I am not Daniel. I haven't been Daniel for decades. I am your wife. I am the person who has stood beside you through everything. Doesn't that matter more than a piece of paper?" Her words cut through the storm, but they could not calm it. The sheriff's world had already crumbled, and his pride bled into fury. 20 years, he whispered again, shaking his head. His eyes brimmed with tears he refused to let fall. "You stole 20 years from me." Evelyn reached for him one last time, her voice trembling. "I didn't steal them. I gave them to you. All of me, every day. And I would again, even knowing this moment was coming." The clock ticked, loud in the silence that followed. Thomas's hand settled on his pistol. Evelyn froze, eyes wide, tears shining in the lamplight. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't let anger take you. I'm still your Evelyn." But to Thomas, her words sounded like ghosts, haunting, hollow. Too late. The sheriff who had spent his life drawing lines between right and wrong now stood blinded by rage, unable to see the difference. And in that room, under the gaze of their wedding photo hanging on the wall, the confrontation teetered on the edge of tragedy. The room felt smaller than it had ever been. The ticking of the clock pounded in Thomas Caldwell's ears, each second daring him to act. His hand gripped the butt of his service pistol, his knuckles white, sweat glistening on his brow. Evelyn stood only a few feet away, trembling, her eyes wide with both fear and love. Her tears shimmered in the lamplight. She reached a hand toward him again, desperate, pleading. "Tom," she whispered, "please, we can face this together. You've always been my anchor. Don't let this destroy us." But her words, meant to soothe, only stoked the fire raging inside him. To Thomas, they sounded like excuses, like threads woven into the fabric of a 20-year deception. His pride screamed louder than her pleas. "You should have told me the truth," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury and heartbreak. "You robbed me of my choice. Do you know what people will say when they find out? Do you know what it does to a man like me?" Evelyn sobbed, shaking her head, I wasn't trying to rob you. I just wanted to live, wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I was. And you did love me, Tom. You still do, even if you can't admit it right now." For a heartbeat, her words pierced a haze of rage. He saw flashes of their life together. Her laughter on summer evenings, her touch after long days, her quiet presence at his side through triumphs and failures alike. A part of him wanted to collapse into that love, to forgive, to cling to it. But another part, dark, unyielding, roared back. That part remembered the paper, the name Daniel Whitaker, the lie that mocked him every time he looked at her. That part told him he could never walk into church, the diner, the sheriff's office again with his head held high. "Sheriff Caldwell," the voice in his head snarled, "you're nothing but a fool." His hand rose, the pistol glinting in the light. Evelyn gasped, stumbling back a step, her hands raised instinctively. "Don't do this," she begged, her voice breaking. "Tom, I'm still your wife. I'm still Evelyn. Nothing changes that. Please, see me, not the secret. See me." The sheriff's chest heaved. For a moment, his finger hovered on the trigger, trembling. Tears finally spilled down his cheeks. He whispered, almost to himself, "You left me no choice." The shot cracked through the room like thunder. Evelyn's body jerked. The sound of her gasp cut short as crimson bloomed across her chest. She collapsed to the carpet, the photograph of their wedding hanging on the wall above her like a cruel witness. Thomas froze, the gun slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. He staggered forward, dropping to his knees beside her. "Evelyn," his voice shattered. He pressed his hands against the wound as if he could undo what he had done. Her eyes fluttered open, filled not with hatred, but with sorrow and love. "I loved you," she whispered, blood staining her lips. Her hand twitched in his, then fell limp. Thomas let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a sob, collapsing over her lifeless body. The clock ticked on, indifferent to the devastation that had just torn to the Caldwell home. Outside, the night remained calm. The roses in the garden swayed gently in the summer breeze, their petals opening toward the moonlight. But inside the house, Sheriff Thomas Caldwell's world had ended with the pull of a trigger. The man who had spent decades protecting others had failed to protect the one person who had given him unconditional love, even in her deepest secret. And as the reality of his actions sank in, Thomas realized the cruelest truth of all. He had not destroyed Evelyn. He had destroyed himself. The gunshot that ended Evelyn Caldwell's life echoed beyond the walls of the sheriff's house. In the quiet Georgia night, the sound carried across the neighborhood like a thunderclap. Curtains parted. Porch lights flicked on. Dogs barked. Within minutes, whispers began to ripple through the street. "Did you hear that?" Sounded like it came from the Caldwell house. "Call 911 right now." By the time the first patrol car screeched to a stop outside, Thomas Caldwell was still on the living room floor, his uniform stained with blood as he clutched Evelyn's body. The pistol lay abandoned on the carpet, glinting under the soft lamp glow. Deputy Aaron Mitchell, one of the younger officers who had idolized the sheriff, stepped inside with his weapon drawn. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Sheriff Caldwell, hands where I can see them." Thomas looked up slowly, his face hollow, eyes rimmed red with tears. His hands, drenched in blood, lifted into the air. "It's done," he whispered, his voice raw. "It's all over." Behind Aaron, Detective Carla Mills entered, her eyes darting between the lifeless body of Evelyn and the man who had led her through countless cases. She froze for only a heartbeat before her training kicked in. Secure the weapon. Get paramedics on the way, though it's too late. Her voice trembled at the edge of disbelief. 2 deputies moved in, placing cuffs on Thomas's wrists. The metallic click echoed in the house like the toll of a funeral bell. He didn't resist. He only lowered his head, his broad shoulders sagging as though the badge pinned to his chest had suddenly become 100 pounds heavier. As they led him toward the door, the neighbors gathered in clusters on the lawn, their faces lit by the strobing blue and red lights. Whispers turned into gasps when they saw who was in custody. "My God, it's the sheriff." "He killed her?" "Sheriff Caldwell." "No, not him. Not Tom." Outside the Caldwell home, the blue and red flash of patrol cars drew neighbors into the street. Millstone was a town where news traveled faster than the sheriff's own sirens, and tonight was no different. By the time the coroner's van arrived, clusters of townsfolk stood under the glow of porch lights, whispering in disbelief. Tom Caldwell? Our sheriff? No, it can't be, one man muttered, his ball cap clenched in his hands. On the corner, at Millstone Diner, the late-night crowd buzzed with theories. The waitress, her voice hushed but urgent, told anyone who would listen. They say he shot her in cold blood. Evelyn, sweet Evelyn. What could she have done to deserve that? At the Baptist church, where Thomas and Evelyn had once occupied the second pew, the pastor bowed his head during an impromptu prayer circle. Lord, give us understanding in this time of darkness, he whispered, his voice cracking. Parishioners shook their heads, struggling to reconcile the man who had led their town parades with a man accused of murder. By morning, the story had spilled onto the front page of the Millstone Gazette. The headline was brutal. Sheriff Caldwell arrested for murder of wife after shocking secret. Coffee shops and barber shops buzzed with debate. Some called him a monster blinded by pride. Others pitted him as a broken man undone by deception. But no one in Millstone could claim life would ever be the same again. Carla Mills followed close behind, already pulling out her notebook. She had admired Thomas for years, but her duty was clear. Tonight, he was not her mentor, not her sheriff. He was a suspect in a homicide. Inside the house, paramedics knelt beside Evelyn's body, but their grim faces confirmed what everyone already knew. The coroner would be next. Evidence markers dotted the floor. Blood splatter, the discarded pistol, the overturned photograph that had fallen from the wall during the chaos. Carla crouched near the coffee table, eyes narrowing on the crumpled documents stained with blood. She lifted them carefully with gloved hands. Birth certificate, medical forms. The name Daniel Whitaker jumped out at her. She exhaled slowly, understanding at last the shadow behind the Caldwell marriage. Outside, Thomas was guided into the back of a patrol car. The same car model he had ridden in for decades, as a symbol of law and authority, now became his cage. The cuffs bit into his wrists. He stared out through the window, his reflection fractured by the flashing lights. He could hear fragments of voices from the crowd, shock, pity, condemnation, but none of it pierced the fog of his grief. As the car pulled away, Carla Mills climbed into her own vehicle, radioing ahead. We've got the sheriff in custody. Suspected homicide of his wife. Scene is secure. I'll be bringing in evidence. Her tone was professional, but beneath it ran a current of sorrow. At the station, silence fell when Thomas was led to the front doors. Deputies who had once saluted him now turned away, their faces pale, their eyes unable to meet his. The man who had sworn them in, who had stood at their weddings and funerals, was now the accused. They placed him in an interrogation room, the same room where he had questioned so many criminals. The irony cut deep. The metal chair was cold under him, the walls closing in. His hands trembled in the cuffs, but his eyes stared blankly at the table. Carla entered moments later, setting down the blood-stained papers with deliberate care. She sat across from him, her face a mixture of duty and disbelief. "Why, Tom?" she asked softly, almost as a friend rather than an investigator. "Why did it have to end like this?" Thomas lifted his head, his voice hoarse, empty, because the truth came too late, and I couldn't live with it. Carla held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded grimly and turned on the recorder. Tonight, justice had turned inward. The lawman had become the lawbreaker, and the town of Millstone would never see its sheriff the same way again. The courthouse of Millstone had never seen a crowd like this. From the moment Sheriff Thomas Caldwell's trial was announced, the building became a magnet for reporters, curious townsfolk, and those who once called him friend. The very man who had sworn to uphold the law now sat accused of cold-blooded murder. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric, every seat filled. The oak-paneled walls seemed to lean closer, holding the weight of history, as the town gathered to watch its own legend unravel. At the defense table, Thomas sat with his attorney, Marcus Hill, a weary but sharp-tongued lawyer known for his persuasive appeals. Thomas's uniform was gone, Instead, he wore a plain gray suit, his hair unkempt, his eyes haunted. Across from him, Assistant State Attorney Karen Stokes stood tall, her navy suit crisp, her expression unwavering. She was relentless, known for dismantling defendants with surgical precision. The judge, Harold Benton, an older man with silver hair and a stern demeanor, entered the room. This court is now in session. The People versus Thomas Caldwell. His gavel struck and silence fell. Karen Stokes rose first. She walked toward the jury box, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her voice carried authority. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are here to decide whether a man of law became a man of blood. Sheriff Caldwell was sworn to protect, but when faced with the truth about his wife, truth that did not threaten his life or safety, he chose murder. This was not self-defense. This was not an accident. This was rage, pride, and cold calculation. And for that, justice demands accountability. Her words sliced through the room. She turned, pointing toward Thomas. The badge does not place him above the law. In fact, it demands more of him. He betrayed that oath the moment he pulled the trigger. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Karen returned to her seat, calm and composed, her gaze steady on the jury. Then Marcus Hill stood. His approach was different. Slower, gentler, almost pleading. He adjusted his glasses, his voice low but resonant. You've heard the prosecution story, but I ask you to remember that Sheriff Caldwell is not a monster. He is a man, a husband who lived 20 years believing he knew his wife completely, only to have that foundation ripped away in a single night. The revelation was catastrophic. It shattered him. He acted not from cold malice, but from unbearable shock, a moment of madness that no one in this room can fully judge unless they lived it themselves. Marcus's hand hovered over Thomas's shoulder, steadying. He is guilty of being human, of breaking under the weight of a secret that should have been shared long ago, but he is not guilty of murder in cold blood. The courtroom sat in tense silence as Judge Benton nodded. The prosecution may call its first witness. Detective Carla Mills took the stand. Her posture was firm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of sorrow as she glanced at Thomas. She recounted the night she arrived, Evelyn's lifeless body, the pistol on the floor, the sheriff's confession. Karen's questioning was direct. Detective Mills, did the defendant resist arrest? No, Carla admitted. He surrendered immediately. And what did he say? He said, "It's done. It's all over." The words hung heavy in the air. Karen pressed on. Would you consider that the statement of a man who acted accidentally? Carla's throat tightened. No, it sounded like someone who made a choice. The jury scribbled notes. Thomas lowered his head. Later, Evelyn's sister, Clara Whitaker, took the stand, her face streaked with tears. She spoke of Evelyn's fear of rejection, her desperate hope to live as her true self. She loved him, Clara sobbed. She loved him with everything she had. All she wanted was to be accepted, and he killed her for being honest too late. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Thomas's jaw clenched, his eyes glassy. When it was time for the defense, Marcus called Deputy Frank Harlan. The loyal friend spoke of Thomas's decades of service, his sacrifices of town, his devotion to Evelyn. He was a good man, Frank said quietly. What happened that night wasn't the sheriff I knew. It was a broken man, cornered by something he couldn't handle. Karen's cross-examination cut sharp. Deputy Harlan, do you condone murder when a man is broken? Frank swallowed hard. No, ma'am, but I believe it wasn't murder. It was a mistake born of shock. Finally, Thomas himself took the stand. The room leaned in as he adjusted the microphone, his hands shaking. His voice was hoarse, cracked. I loved her, he said simply. For 20 years, I loved her. But when I found those papers, something inside me snapped. I couldn't see Evelyn anymore. I could only see the lie. I know I should have walked away. I know I should have listened. But I didn't. I let anger be my judge, jury, and executioner. And now she's gone. That's on me. Tears ran down his face. Some jurors looked away. Others stared with sympathy. Karen's final question was like a dagger. Sheriff Caldwell, would you agree that Evelyn never raised a hand against you? that she posed no threat to your life that night. Thomas hesitated, then whispered, "Yes." The courtroom gasped. It was the admission Karen needed. The day ended with the judge's gavel. Court is adjourned until tomorrow. As the crowd filed out, whispers filled the air. Some saw Thomas as a murderer, others as a broken man destroyed by pride and shock. But all agreed on one thing. Millstone would never forget this trial. Thomas sat at the defense table, wrists bound, staring at the empty chair where Evelyn once sat at his side. For the first time in decades, the sheriff felt utterly, devastatingly alone. The courthouse buzzed with restless energy on the morning the jury returned. After days of testimony, of raw tears and bitter arguments, the people of Millstone filled every seat and lined the hallway outside. This was the moment they had waited for, the final word on their sheriff. Thomas Caldwell sat at the defense table, shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a week. Marcus Hill sat beside him, whispering last words of encouragement, but Thomas barely heard. Across the aisle, Karen Stokes adjusted her blazer, her gaze steady, her posture sharp. When Judge Benton entered, the room fell silent. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The jury filed in, 12 solemn faces bearing the weight of justice. Judge Benton cleared his throat. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman, a middle-aged teacher with trembling hands, stood. "We have, Your Honor." She passed a folded slip of paper to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Benton unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words before handing it back. His voice was steady, but the weight of the decision pressed down on every syllable. "In the matter of the state versus Thomas Caldwell, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The word struck the room like a hammer. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some cried out in sorrow. Others nodded grimly. A woman clutched her chest. Someone whispered, "God help us." Thomas closed his eyes, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. He did not look surprised. He did not protest. It was as if he had already sentenced himself long before this day. Marcus Hill placed a hand on his arm. "We'll appeal," he murmured, though even he sounded unconvinced. Karen Stokes stood, her voice firm. "Your Honor, the people request that sentencing be carried out today." Judge Benton nodded. "So ordered. Sheriff Caldwell, please rise." Thomas stood slowly, his wrists cuffed, the chains clinking softly in the hushed courtroom. The judge's eyes, usually cool and detached, now held a glimmer of sorrow. "Thomas Caldwell," Benton began, his voice resonant, "you have served this community for 3 decades. You wore the badge with pride. You kept order in our town. But the law you swore to uphold was shattered the night you took your wife's life. Pride and anger cannot stand as justification for murder. Not in this courtroom. Not in any." He paused, the silence heavy. "The sentence of this court is life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck once, sealing Thomas's fate. A cry rose from the gallery. Evelyn's sister, Clara, sobbing into her hands. Deputies shifted uncomfortably, tore between loyalty to the man who had once led them in duty to the law now condemning him. Thomas's face was unreadable, carved from stone, yet in his eyes flickered something fragile, a grief deeper than rage, deeper than pride. He bowed his head, whispering to no one but himself, "Evelyn, forgive me." As the bailiff led him toward the exit, the crowd parted like water. Whispers chased him down the aisle. He was supposed to protect us. He loved her. He still killed her. What a waste, what a tragedy. Outside, cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions. "Sheriff Caldwell, do you have any regrets? Was this murder about pride? Do you think justice was served?" Thomas said nothing. The cuffs on his wrists gleamed in the sunlight as he was loaded into the transport van, the same kind of vehicle he had used countless times to haul criminals to jail. Now it was his turn. Inside the courthouse, Judge Benton addressed the shaken jury, thanking them for their service. Karen Stokes gathered her files with quiet resolve. Marcus Hill slumped in his chair, defeated, knowing his client's life as he knew it was over. But it was Carla Mills, the detective who had once admired Thomas as a mentor, who lingered the longest. She stood alone in the courtroom, staring at the empty defense table. For years, she had believed Sheriff Caldwell represented everything right about Millstone. Now she wondered if she would ever trust an institution, or a man, so completely again. In the end, the verdict was more than just a sentence for Thomas Caldwell. It was a wound carved into the heart of Millstone. The people had lost a leader. Evelyn had lost her life, and the truth, that fragile, elusive thing, had destroyed them both. And as the courthouse emptied, the echoes of that gavel still lingered, a reminder that justice may be served, but it never comes without cost. The iron door clanged shut behind Thomas Caldwell, sealing the life he once knew on the other side. The sheriff of Millstone was gone. In his place stood inmate number 54219, a man stripped of his badge, his pride, and the only love he had ever known. Prison was not kind to him. The first weeks were filled with stares from men who had once cursed his name in court. Sheriff Caldwell, they muttered with twisted grins, as if the fall of a lawman gave them a strange satisfaction. Guards, too, struggled to hide their unease. Some had served under him. Now they watched him shuffle to the chow line like any other convict. Thomas carried himself quietly, keeping to the cell, avoiding conflict. Yet no matter how low he tried to shrink, the weight of memory pressed heavy on his shoulders. Nights were the worst. The cold concrete walls seemed to whisper Evelyn's voice back to him, soft, trembling, filled with love. I never wanted to hurt you, Tom. I only wanted to be loved. Each time he heard it in the silence, tears cut down his weathered face. Years passed. His hair turned white, his frame stooped, but the torment never eased. He worked in the prison library, shelving books he rarely opened, staring instead at the pages as though searching for answers that never came. He wrote letters, though most remained unfinished. Some were addressed to Evelyn, letters he would fold carefully and tuck beneath his pillow, as if she might one day read them beyond the grave. One evening, Carla Mills visited. She was older now, lines etched deeper into her face, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. They sat across from each other in the visitation room, a glass panel between them. You look tired, Tom, she said softly. He gave a faint, humorless smile. Prison will do that to a man. Carla studied him for a long moment before asking the question that had haunted her since the night of the murder. Do you regret it? Thomas's gaze dropped to his hands, chained to the table. His voice was low, raw. Every breath I take is regret. I killed the only person who ever loved me without condition, and I did it because I couldn't face the truth. Not hers, not mine. Carla's throat tightened, but she nodded. That's all I needed to know. She stood, leaving him alone once more. In the years that followed, Thomas rarely spoke to anyone. His reputation faded. His name mentioned only in hushed tones when townsfolk recalled the sheriff who had lost everything. Evelyn's grave back in Millstone became a quiet place of flowers and tears, tended faithfully by her sister. Her name was remembered with kindness, his with caution. On his final night, Thomas sat in his cell under the dim glow of a flickering bulb. He pulled out one last letter, his handwriting shaky but deliberate. Evelyn, I see you every night in my dreams. I hear your laughter in the silence, feel your hand in mine. If love is eternal, then maybe I have not lost you completely. But I know I don't deserve to find you again. I pray you forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours. I pray that in whatever heaven you walk now, my name is no longer a weight you carry. You gave me 20 years of love, and I repaid you with a bullet. I am the one who truly died that night. He folded the letter and placed it under his pillow like all the others. Then he lay back, closed his eyes, and let the silence take him. When the guards found him the next morning, they said he looked peaceful. But those who remembered Sheriff Thomas Caldwell knew peace was something he had lost long ago, in a small living room where pride drowned out love. And in Millstone, the story lingered, a reminder that truth, no matter how painful, must never be hidden too long. Because secrets, once revealed, can shatter even the strongest hearts and turn the law's protector into its prisoner.